Hi friends, so now we're beginning with endocrine system. Again, we're going to take an integrated approach wherein I start with physiology and then we're going to be doing it system-wise along with path, medicine and pharmacology. So first we'll be looking at diabetes mellitus, after that we'll go into pituitary, then we'll look at the calcium parathyroid metabolism, all of those disorders, this one giant table together that we will compile, then adrenal, and after that we will have thyroid. Alright, so all of the systems we are going to be doing one after the other. So let's begin then. The first thing is something which always gets you question, and this is core stuff that goes into your choti copy. You have to revise this and go, and this is very important. Okay, so this is about the actions and the secondary messengers of different hormones. So a lot of hormones act directly, while a few so a lot of hormones act via secondary messengers. They attach on the cell membrane to these G protein coupled receptor, which is the serpentine chain of receptor, and it has different subunits, and depending on the subunit that it binds to, like you can see GQ, GS, GI, different secondary pathways result. Okay, so this is the first list, and then there are others which directly have their action, which also we will talk about. Okay, now let's start with the hormones which act via G protein coupled receptor. Okay, so the first one is the hormones which bind to GQ. So for this, the trick is have one M&M and GOT. So you know Game of Thrones. So after you're done with your exams, you want to chill out, have M&Ms, which is a candy, and relax and watch GOT, right? So that is what our mnemonic is, have one M&M and GOT. So from have one M&M, what you remember is H1, which is histamine 1, alpha 1 receptor, V1 receptor of ADH, M&M meaning M1 and M3 muscarinic receptors, and from AND you remember angiotensin 2. Okay, so this is sorted. I'm sure you will remember this. Have one M&M. GOT from Game of Thrones. When I say Game of Thrones, what all things come to your mind? First, there's a lot of wine involved, so you want to remember gastrin. Second, there are a lot of gonads involved, so you want to remember GnRH, gonadotropin hormone. Then you want to remember oxytocin as well, and you're going to have a lot of tachycardia while watching GOT, so you remember TRH. TRH, not TSH. Okay, so this is about all of the hormones which act via GQ receptor, which increases IP3 and DAG. So this activates the phospholipase C enzyme, which activates IP3 and DAG. All right. So this is have one M&M and GOT, gastrin, GnRH, oxytocin, and TRH. Okay, so this is sorted. Now we directly go to GI. I meaning inhibitory, so this reduces the CAMP, alright, so this reduces the activity of adenylate cyclase and thereby reduces CAMP levels. This is MAD2, so easy, M2, alpha 2, D2. These are the hormone receptors which act by reducing CAMP. Whatever that is left is GS. Now, I wouldn't want you to memorize this list at all. Do it by exclusion. Remember the other mnemonics and then do it by exclusion. But just in case you want a mnemonic that, no ma'am, I want mnemonic for everything. Then I'm going to give you one mnemonic which is flat, champ, chug. Alright, so that is what you want to remember here. So let's just go through this one more time. No need to remember, do it by exclusion is what I would recommend. But let's just go through it. FSH, LH, ACTH, TSH. So these are all pituitary hormones, flat hormones. CHAMP would be CRH, HCG, V2. V1 we've already done. This is V2. MSH and parathyroid. From CHUG, you remember calcitonin, H2. H1 we've already done. This is H2. Glucagon and GHRH. Remember GnRH already done. This is GHRH. And all beta receptors. Very important. Beta doesn't figure anywhere else, isn't it? So all beta receptors act by increasing the level of CAMP. Alright. So CAMP is the main hormone secondary messenger for all of these guys. Okay. Here one more thing that you can notice is that you see how glucagon increases CAMP. So that is why, you know, if you see the antidotes list that I've taught you in forensic BTR, we have seen that glucagon is an antidote for beta blockers, isn't it? So this also explains how beta blockers will have reduced CAMP, whereas glucagon increases, isn't it? So that is how it actually acts. So this is also one thing that we can integrate and learn. Okay, then CGMP. So guanylate cyclase is what these three act by. Again, easy. BAN, CGMP. So here, very easy. BNP, ANP and nitric oxide. This has been asked so many times. Two things about NO always keep cropping up in the exam. One is the secondary messenger, which now we know as cGMP. And second, something that I've taught you in biochemistry, which is the amino acid that is responsible for NO synthesis. So that is arginine. Alright, so remember these two things. Very important. Okay, so this is about GPCR. Now, there are certain hormones which are lipid soluble. They can cross the cell membrane and either bind to cytoplasmic receptors or intranuclear receptors. Now, one question comes, is this going to be fast or is this going to be slow? So, instinctively, you would think that these are doing their own job, must be faster, but answer is no. Answer is because they are directly affecting the DNA, they are actually regulating the transcription. As you can see, they're actually regulating transcription, and that is a slower process. All right, so these hormones actually act slower than the ones that we have done here, which act by GPCR. All right, so that's one thing that is slightly anti-instinctive, if I may call that. Then you want to remember what are these hormones. So here steroids have intracytoplasmic receptors. All right, so they have intracytoplasmic receptors which they bind to, which then regulates the DNA response, whereas PrEP TV directly has intranuclear receptors. Slight controversy here where some people and some resources say different things, but this is grossly what is the consensus. So intranuclear receptor is going to be progesterone, estrogen, so your sex hormones, and you want to remember TV, thyroid hormone, so T3, T4, and vitamin A and D. So these are the ones which have direct intranuclear receptors. Okay, so this is about direct action. Then we talk about very, very important, the hormones which act via receptor tyrosine kinase. So here what happens is when the hormone binds to the receptor, the phosphorylation happens on that same receptor, and then you have the activation of MAP kinase pathway. Very important, receptor tyrosine kinase activates the MAP kinase pathway. This is very important. What acts by this? Mainly you want to remember insulin, and then you remember PIFE. PIFE is very easy because you just have to add a GF at the end of it, except a D in P also. So PDGF, and then you just write PIFE and just make it GF. So here you have platelet derived growth factor, insulin like growth factor, fibroblastic growth factor, and epidermal growth factor. All right, so PIFE is what you remember. So insulin, PIFE act by receptor tyrosine kinase and MAP kinase. Then very important, we have non-receptor tyrosine kinase. So the hormone binds to the cytokine receptor, then there is phosphorylation of the tyrosine kinase, which is not binding to the hormone actually. And here what you want to remember is the secondary pathway which is activated, that is JAK-STAT. So here it was MAP kinase, here it is JAK-STAT. A very important question that gets asked. I remember when I was preparing also, this question had come. All right, so this is JAK-STAT pathway, this is piglet. So what is piglet? Here two main hormones is P and G. So prolactin and growth hormone always go together. All right, so that's what you want to remember. They are both acting via JAK-STAT. Extremely, extremely important. So insulin by direct receptor tyrosine kinase, PRL and GH by JAK-STAT is the most important takeaway, and then you have certain cytokines here and there. So I is interleukin 2, G is GM-CSF, so granulocyte monocyte colony stimulating factor. From L you have leptin, and E and T is EPO and TPO, so erythropoietin and thrombopoietin. So all of these act via JAK-STAT. So this is our hormone actions. Now we start off with diabetes mellitus, integrated everything that you need to know from pharma, from medicine about diabetes. Very, very important. Okay. So first of all, a few values. This is very easy. I'm sure you guys know it, but just to put it out there, you need to be aware of this. So here, when we look at the screening of diabetes mellitus, so there are three sets of values that you actually need to remember: normal, impaired glucose tolerance, and diabetes mellitus. So before you are diabetic, you are pre-diabetic, and what is the definition of that is also very important. Now that so many cases are increasing, we're becoming the diabetes capital of the world, and we need to know about pre-diabetic state so that we can control it as well. All right, so all of these figures become very, very important. So everywhere two numbers I will give you to remember. Before that is normal, in between is impaired, more than that is diabetes. That's going to be the approach for all four of these. Okay. So HbA1c, two values that you remember is 5.7, 6.5. Anybody lesser than 5.7 HbA1c, which is a reflection of the glycemic control for the last 3 months, as you know, is normal. 5.7 to 6.5 is impaired glucose tolerance, and more than 6.5 is going to be diabetes mellitus. Okay. For fasting blood sugar, the values that you remember are 100 to 126. Less than 100 is normal. In between is impaired glucose tolerance, and more than 126 fasting is the definition of diabetes mellitus. Random blood sugar, you remember 140 to 200. Less than 140 is normal. In between, impaired, and more than 200 is diabetes mellitus. OGTT is after giving a 75 gram glucose load and then measuring after 2 hours. Again, it's the same range, 140 to 200. Less than 140 is normal, in between is impaired, and more than 200 is diabetes mellitus. All right. Just to repeat, diabetes is more than 6.5 HbA1c, 126 fasting, and 200 random or after OGTT. Alright, so this is about the values. Now, while we're doing values, let's just take it out of the way. Metabolic syndrome, the NCEP ATP3 definition, very important, very cliched question, which has been important since ages. So, you need to know these values, everything very important. So, central obesity, the definition is more than 102 or 88 centimeter. This is for the world, but for India, it is 90 and 80. The cutoff is lower for us. So remember 90 and 80. You can remember both values actually, because you don't know what the examiner might put. Triglyceride 150 or more, HDL less than 14 men, less than 15 women, BP either of them, either 130 systolic or 85 diastolic, any of them is increased, it is the definition, and fasting more than 100. So here we are taking the impaired value, not the 126, mind that. Okay, so these are all the definitions. So they can ask you all of the following are included in metabolic syndrome criteria, except, so they can give you values, they can give you just the criteria, everything you need to memorize. So this again becomes our hashtag choti copy stuff. Okay. Right. So now very important table which I've compiled for you is to understand the pathophysiology of the 4 types of diabetes. I'm sure you knew type 1, type 2. I've brought 2 more for you. So what is LADA is latent autoimmune diabetes of adult, whereas MODY is maturity onset diabetes of young. Okay, so pretty contrasting definitions. So first, let's understand what is type 1 diabetes. So in type 1 diabetes, it is basically a type of autoimmunity. LADA is just like type 1 except in adults. That is how you want to remember that this is also autoimmune disorder, just that it presents in adults, whereas type 1 presents in children. Both of them have autoantibodies associated. They are more specifically defined in LADA. So the antibodies that you look at are anti-GAD, which is glutamic acid decarboxylase, or anti-islet cell. So islet cell is pretty self-explanatory. So anti-islet cell or anti-GAD are the antibodies which are frequently associated with both types actually. Okay. So diabetes frequently presents in young patients, usually younger than 20 years, whereas LADA is gonna present in adults. So this is the main definition, the main difference that you have in both of them. All right. So that's very important. In both of these types, the main pathophysiology is that the beta cell mass reduces. Once the beta cell mass reduces, obviously the insulin levels go down. So in both of them, the insulin levels are low. So because insulin levels are low, what have we done in biochemistry? Whenever insulin is high, you're going to have anabolic pathways, isn't it? You're going to have fatty acid synthesis, cholesterol synthesis, all of that is not going to happen. So here in both of these, you're going to have thin built patients. Okay. So that's one very important fact. Histopath wise in type 1 diabetes, what you're going to see is leukocyte infiltration. So this could be a path question. You will see leukocyte infiltration, which is destroying the beta cell mass, and here because insulin is low, beta cells are only not there. Do you think oral hypoglycemics will help? No, oral hypoglycemic agents will not help here, and you are gonna have insulin dependence. That's why this is known as insulin dependent diabetes mellitus. Okay, so that is important. Same with LADA, oral hypoglycemics will not act because the beta cell mass is not working. So you can see how both of them are same except for the age of presentation. Talking about type 2. Here, the main pathophysiology is related to insulin resistance. There is insulin resistance which is developing because of high levels of adiponectin. Alright, so here again the age of onset is going to be in adults usually. The habitus is going to be obesity. So the patients are going to be obese here. Why? Because so here the habitus is going to be obese. The patients are going to be obese. Why? Because of the insulin resistance, the insulin levels initially actually increase. They are actually higher because of the resistance. The pancreas produces more and more, but eventually gives up. Initially you try, but then you give up. That's what happens in life. That's what happens with pancreas. That initially it produces very high insulin, but then slowly it gives up and eventually the levels decrease. And because insulin is high here, you're going to have a lot of anabolic pathways and you're going to have obesity. Okay, so that's the pathophysiology there. Beta cell mass, again, initially they remain normal, but eventually they're going to go down because there is a myeloid deposition. Very, very important. Eventually there is a myeloid deposition which is known as islet associated peptide protein. I've taught you this in amyloidosis in path as well. Alright, so this is very important that here you have leukocyte and here you have a myeloid. Okay. Apart from that, yes, they do respond to oral hypoglycemics. The beta cell mass is normal, so there will be secretagogues which can increase the insulin stimulation. Okay. MODY. Now, MODY is a very important type because so far everything is polygenetic, especially when we consider type 2. There is not one gene, there are multiple genes which are associated. But in MODY, what you want to remember is that this is the only type that is monogenetic. It has a specific criteria. There has to be presentation in less than 25 years and 2 or more generations have to be affected. So this is the specific criteria, that it is autosomal dominant, presentation is less than 25 years and 2 or more generations need to be affected. Remember, in MODY, the most common type is type 3 and the gene is HNF1 alpha. So type 3, 1 is most common. So 1 alpha is what is the most common gene to be mutated. Alright, what about the insulin levels here? So the insulin levels again are reduced. Initially they can remain normal, but eventually they go down. Same with the beta cell mass, that initially they remain normal, very, very slowly they can go down. So more or less everything here is normal, alright, except for the family history. The patient really doesn't come with a ketotic kind of a presentation or very, very drastic hypoglycemic episode. That does not happen because more or less the insulin levels and beta cell mass is on the normal side. And what is very important, in fact, a part of the diagnostic criteria as well is that he should respond to sulfonylureas, he should respond to oral hypoglycemics because his beta cell mass is normal. Alright, so this is how you can remember. So basically, just to simplify this slightly scary looking table is type 1 and LADA go together, whereas type 2 and MODY go together except the ages. Alright, so that's how we can actually remember this. Now let's talk about two phenomena as far as complications are concerned. Not really complications, but two phenomena in which both of these you are gonna have morning hypoglycemia. The patient measures the morning sugar and that is high. So there are two phenomena that you need to understand. One is dawn phenomenon, second is Somogy phenomenon. So first one is dawn phenomenon. How to distinguish it is to look at the overnight, middle of the night sugar. That is normal here in dawn phenomenon. So what dawn tells you, during dawn is the cause here. During dawn, overall physiologically the insulin sensitivity reduces, and because this insulin sensitivity reduces, that is why the person has a higher blood sugar. It is nothing to do with the fact that something happened in the night or overnight. It was normal middle of the night, just in the morning it is high. That's how you remember it. Insulin sensitivity reduction is the probable cause. Nobody really knows for sure how these occur and there are different theories, but this is the most accepted one that you want to remember. And how to control it, how to treat it is you give frequent glucose monitoring. So it's better that the patient takes continuous glucose monitoring and infusion rather than just a basal glucose which is increased. All right, so you could increase the nighttime basal glucose, but overall what is better than increasing the basal glucose is continuous glucose monitoring, and then you can do an infusion. All right, so this is about dawn phenomenon. On the other hand, look at this. This is how you distinguish. Here the blood sugar was low, and that is why you have a rebound hyperglycemic episode in the morning. So this is known as Somogyi phenomenon. So you want to remember Somogyi as so much insulin. Patient is taking higher insulin at bedtime. It is not higher, but let's say that the patient did not like what was for dinner that night, and the patient skipped a meal or had a lower meal. So the glucose was not up to the level of insulin, and that is why you have a low blood sugar in the overnight, and then because of counter-regulatory hormones, it increases. All right, so much. So what is the management of this? Is to reduce the bedtime insulin here. So this is how you can actually remember these very complicated phenomenon otherwise, but just to remember a simplified version, just remember the overnight glucose is how you distinguish. It is normal in dawn. So dawn tells you ki dawn mein hi problem hai, whereas in Somogyi it is so much insulin. All right, now you have this cutaneous manifestation in diabetes. A lot of you might look at it and tell me it is glucagonoma because it does look like necrolytic migratory erythema. I would accept it, but if I tell you it's a case of diabetes, there's a specific lesion with diabetes which is known as necrobiosis lipoidica diabeticorum. Very scary name, isn't it? Don't even try to memorize it, otherwise one system would come out of the brain. So we don't want that. Just read this once, and if you look at the exam, such an option comes, you will definitely recognize it. All right, so scary lesion, scary name is how you can remember. Then a few questions about the complications. As you know, there are micro and macrovascular complications. So what you want to remember is that if you have a good glycemic control, it can reduce the microvascular complications such as neuropathy, retinopathy, nephropathy, whereas mortality will undergo no change. Even if you have a good control, mortality doesn't undergo any change because the most common cause of mortality is the macrovascular changes, isn't it? The most common microvascular complication is actually diabetic neuropathy. All right. Diabetic neuropathy is the most common cause of microvascular complication, and the most common type is distal symmetrical sensory motor. This can also be described as a glove and stocking kind of a neuropathy. Okay, so these are the one-liners that you want to remember from diabetes. Now let's talk about the management. So pharmacology. So first we have insulin. Insulin mainly we are going to be using it for patients of type 1 and LADA who are insulin dependent, who have low beta cell mass. So insulin, most common route of giving the insulin is going to be subcutaneous. All right, so it's going to be given by subcutaneous. Either injections or a continuous pump can be given, which is preferred. Or remember, in diabetic ketoacidosis we would have to give IV insulin, and the only insulin which can be given IV is the regular insulin. All other insulin types are for subcutaneous. That's the route. Then, so depending on the half-lives, we have different types. The first one is ultra short. Ultra short, you remember lag. And one more trick is everybody has an S, short ka S in their name. So you have Lispro, Aspartame, Glulisine, which are your ultra short, which have a peak of around 1 hour. So this is their peak at around 1 hour. Okay. Then you have the regular insulin, which has a peak at around 3 hours. This is the only one which can be given IV. So regular comes under the short acting category. Then you have NPH, which comes under the intermediate category, which has a peak at around 5 hours. All right, 5 to 6 hours. So this is your NPH. And then you have your basal insulins or peakless insulins. These are your basal insulins without any peak, and their half-life is roughly 24 hours. And now we have a new one, which is Degludec, which has the longest life of around 42 hours. So 24, you can invert it to become 42 hours. All right, so Degludec, Detamir and Glargine. A lot of students confuse Glulisine with Glargine. So as I said, S meaning it's short. Okay, that's how you can distinguish. Remember, glargine has an acidic pH. It has a pH which is lesser than 4, and that is why you should not mix this with any other insulin type, whereas the others can be mixed. Okay, so this is about the insulin types. I hope this is clear. Now, insulin, remember, has a few side effects. It is going to cause weight gain, and obviously hypoglycemia is one side effect which it obviously will have. Apart from that, you can have lipoatrophy, and that is why you must switch the sites of the subcutaneous injections. You have to keep switching it in order to prevent lipoatrophy. What it does to potassium is so important. It causes hypokalemia. So one thing you want to remember is there are two things potassium is very afraid of. As soon as these are there, potassium will go and hide inside the cell. It undergoes a transcellular spread. So you have insulin and you have beta agonists like salbutamol. So whenever potassium sees these drugs, it hides. So there is hypokalemia, and that is why we can use this for hyperkalemia, right? We can use this for management of hyperkalemia. One more list of pharma. There are going to be so many lists of pharma, isn't it? So this is one of them that you want to put it in your choti copy. So what are the drugs which cause diabetes mellitus or an impaired glucose tolerance or hyperglycemia? One is steroids, thiazide, niacin. Thiazide and niacin both cause hyperglycemia, hyperlipidemia, hyperuricemia. All of these are side effects. You have phenytoin and protease inhibitors, clozapine, you know, and in fact all atypical antipsychotics we've studied have metabolic side effects, maximum with clozapine because it has highest efficacy, beta agonists and interferon alpha. Alright, so these are all of the drugs which are causing diabetes. Just look at this one more time in your choti copy before the exam, and that should be it. Okay. Now, one compiled list of all oral hypoglycemics. This is so important. So now, before I scare you with this table, let me just show you in a nutshell how different agents are gonna act. Alright. So first are the secretagogues. By secretagogues, I mean the agents which can increase insulin secretion. So obviously, this is only gonna be effective in type 2 diabetes, isn't it? So here, what are the drugs? One, you have sulfonylureas, you have meglitinides, and two are incretins, meaning they normally increase. These are physiological compounds which increase insulin in response to an oral glucose load. Alright. So we have GLP-1 analogs and we have DPP-4 inhibitors. DPP-4 is nothing but the agent which metabolizes GLP-1, or you inhibit its metabolism, right? So these are basically acting by the same method. So these two increase insulin secretion, but they don't cause hypoglycemia. Very important that sulfonylurea and meglitinides cause hypoglycemia, whereas the other two do not. Alright, so they frequently ask you what are the agents that cause hypoglycemia. So these two drugs you want to remember, and you will notice that all of their names end with ides. Okay, they end with ides, the exception being GLP-1 analogs. Okay, this we will see. Apart from this, these incretins also have an action of reducing the glucagon and reducing gastric emptying. So they also promote satiety, isn't it? So these are also basically the actions of the GLP, and you also have amylin analogs in the form of pramlintide, which is also acting by these two mechanisms and not increasing insulin secretion. So this is about the drugs which are increasing insulin secretion, and then we have our GLP incretins. Then you want to remember the drugs which increase insulin sensitivity. Very important for type 2 diabetes again. So here you have biguanides, the most important is metformin, and you have thiazolidinediones, all of your glitazones, pioglitazone, rosiglitazone comes under this category. One more new drug which has been included here, not actually a new drug but new anti-diabetic drug, which is bromocriptine. So bromocriptine, also the hypothesis is that it increases the insulin sensitivity. Then you have the drugs which are SGLT2 inhibitors. We have studied SGLT in biochemistry. Yeah, so these inhibit the reabsorption of glucose from the kidney. So these are your glyphosine drugs, canagliflozin and so on. Alpha glucosidase inhibitors are going to reduce the absorption from the intestine. So they prevent the breakdown of complex carbohydrates to simple carbohydrates. Alright, so this is in a nutshell the mechanism which is the most important part in oral hypoglycemics. Now we are slightly sensitized and now we go through them one by one. Most important is going to be their side effects and their mechanism we've already done. Okay, so sulfonylureas and meglitinides, you know, they increase insulin secretion. The mechanism is going to be that they bind to these potassium channels. When they inhibit the potassium channels, you're going to have more insulin release. Okay, so this is going to be by inhibiting potassium channels. So sulfonylureas, the first generation sulfonylurea has chlorpropamide. Second generation would be glipizide or glyburide, whereas meglitinide is repa and nateglinide. So what you see is all of them ending with ides. They are your insulin secretagogues, and that is why they cause hypoglycemia. And because insulin is increasing, yeah, they are also going to cause anabolic effects such as weight gain. Alright, so in every drug you want to remember weight gain or weight loss. First one is pretty logical, higher insulin, so hypoglycemia and weight gain. Three specific side effects of chlorpropamide that you want to remember. One is SIADH, second is cholestatic jaundice, and third is disulfiram-like reaction. Okay, so three specific side effects of chlorpropamide: cholestatic jaundice, SIADH and disulfiram-like reaction. Don't confuse this with chlorpromazine. A lot of students do that, which is an antipsychotic. So in chlorpromazine as well, in fact, you know, incidentally, you have cholestatic jaundice as a side effect there itself, but there you have one more if you remember your psyche, is they have vortex keratopathy, isn't it? So that has two side effects. That's how we had remembered chlorpromazine. Okay, so that is about the first secretagogues category that we have done. Going on to the most important, most commonly drug used in practice, which is metformin, which is a biguanide. So it decreases insulin resistance by stimulating AMP kinase. This is what you want to remember. Very important is you never give metformin in somebody who has renal failure. So you have to check a baseline creatinine in all patients. If that is deranged, you will not give metformin because that can lead to lactic acidosis. This is one drug which induces weight loss. Very important. Weight loss. It will have B12 deficiency, so it can cause megaloblastic anemia, and this is the agent which has a maximum reduction in HbA1c. So theoretically, this is the most effective drug. Thiazolidinediones, wherein you have pio and rosiglitazone, they, very important, activate PPAR gamma receptors and reduce insulin resistance. So PPAR gamma is very important. Okay, here common side effect is going to be weight gain. So again, so it's alternating weight gain, weight loss, then weight gain. Very important, they increase the risk of heart failure by fluid retention. They are hepatotoxic, and there is also a risk of fractures, which is a repeat question. Remember specific side effects. Bladder cancer, it is with pioglitazone. You want to remember P with bladder. So P is pioglitazone, and MI, rose he. Daily, in Hindi we say rose he. I see one case of MI in our country, isn't it? So common. So remember rose he, rosiglitazone. Alright, so this is how we remember these two specific side effects. Then going on to the incretins, so GLP-1 agonist or DPP-4 inhibitors. The agonists are going to be exenatide, liraglutide and semaglutide is the oral one, whereas the other two are subcutaneous injections. So remember, these are eyed drugs, but they do not cause hypoglycemia. Alright, so that's important. DPP-4 inhibitors are your gliptins, so sitasaxine, linagliptin are your drugs here. So as we have seen, they increase the glucose load dependent insulin secretion, and that is why they don't have hypoglycemia. They decrease glucagon and they decrease AMPing and they increase the satiety. That's why they have weight loss. So again, you are seeing alternating gain and loss, but here it's very logical why they have weight loss, isn't it? Extremely important, pancreatitis is a specific side effect of your GLP-1 agonist, whereas nasopharyngitis, very common, but this somehow I feel is a very potential question, is for DPP-4 inhibitors. Alright, so this is about the incretins. Then we have amylin analogs, which acts by two of the other mechanisms, glucagon and gastric emptying, no other side effect as such. Alpha glucosidase is acarbose and miglitol, and because this reduces the intestinal breakdown of the complex sugars, this can cause diarrhea and flatulence, and that is why it is contraindicated in inflammatory bowel disease. And SGLT2 inhibitors, remember, glyphosate is extremely important. They increase the glucose secretion in the urine, and that is why they predispose to UTI and polyuria because of osmotic diuresis, and they also have weight loss. Okay, so weight gain and weight loss is something that you want to see again. And also remember, pramlintide is approved for type 1 as well. This is the only one which is FDA approved for type 1 diabetes mellitus. Okay, so this is about all of the oral hypoglycemics in a nutshell. Going on to complications, so diabetic ketoacidosis and hyperglycemic hyperosmolar syndrome. So first of all, how do you distinguish them? So remember, glucose, if you look at, is going to be in the range of around 250 to 300, whereas in hyperosmolar coma, you're going to have very high glucose in the range of around 500 to 600. Okay, ABG in DKA, as the name suggests, is going to reveal high anion gap metabolic acidosis, extremely important. And with this, you can also remember that this is going to show you small breathing, which is a rapid deep breaths that we are going to be seeing in recipe as well. So going to be this rapid deep breath, which is nothing but hyperventilation in order to compensate for the metabolic acidosis, whereas that is not what you're going to see in HHS, which is mainly going to present with neurological symptoms. So here you're going to have neurological symptoms with altered sensorium because of the hyperosmolarity predominantly. All right, so that is what you want to remember. The ABG here is going to be more or less normal. There's not going to be any metabolic acidosis. The ketone levels are going to be positive in urine and plasma in DK, whereas they are going to be normal in HHS. The demographic that you're going to see here are frequently type 1 diabetic patients who are young and who basically have either some sort of fever or some sort of high stress in the form of infection. So they have further increase in the fatty acid oxidation, which results in higher ketone body. So that is the pathophysiology here, that there is more ketone body synthesis which results, whereas here you are going to have elderly patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus who are frequently dehydrated. There's nobody to take care of them and they frequently miss their fluids. They are mainly dehydrated, which results in the increased osmolarity. That is the main difference in both of them. The mortality is much higher in HHS, whereas it is lower in cases of DKA. All right, and the most common cause of mortality is actually neurological here, cerebral edema. Okay, so this is about a difference conceptually. Management wise, it is pretty much same, wherein remember, even though your first instinct would be to give insulin because it is diabetes, first is to give them IV fluids. All right, especially HHS, the mainstay is IV fluids and not insulin because dehydration is the cause. Okay, so this is what you need to understand. Even in DK, you want to give IV fluids plus insulin, never insulin alone. Okay, so IV fluids is the recommended normal saline, and you can start dextrose once the glucose is less than 200. Continuous IV insulin, so you know which insulin? Regular insulin, isn't it? That's the only one that can be given IV. That has to be started and not subcutaneous. You can start the subcutaneous insulin once the patient is able to eat, glucose is less than 200, anion gap is less than 12, or bicarb is more than 15. So these are the criteria to start subcutaneous insulin. Very, very important that in DKA particularly, patient is in a state of potassium depletion. Extremely important. All right, so the patient is in a state of potassium depletion, and that is why you should add IV potassium if the potassium is less than 5.2. Make it a point to measure the ABG first. Before you start the treatment, you should measure the sodium potassium values. Very important. So add IV potassium if potassium is less than 5.2, and you can hold insulin if it is less than 3.3, because when you start insulin, the potassium will further go down in the serum because of transcellular spread, and that can result in arrhythmias. So this is again an important point, that if the baseline potassium is less than 3.3, just hold the insulin for a while, first supplement potassium and then start insulin. Okay, and because there is so much acidosis, if it is severe acidosis wherein pH is less than 6.9, that's an indication of bicarb. So you might not get this detailed sort of a question in the exam about the criteria. You can get it in INICET, but usually the questions will be just to recognize DK. They'll give you type 1 patient with a fruity odor, pain abdomen, Kussmaul breathing. What will you do next? You just have to say, I will start IV fluids and insulin. That's all about it. I've just given you everything in detail because this is an emergency, and emergencies become very, very important for the exams. All right. Okay, so this takes care of diabetes for us. We move on straight to the brain, to pituitary gland. So pituitary, you have to understand this regulation of hormones here, okay? So very simple enough, like all of these are simple, just a few cross connections I want to highlight here. So in the pituitary, you have basophils and you have acidophils. You know GH and prolactin go together. Even in the secondary pathway, do you remember piglet? They are going together as non-receptor tyrosine kinase because they are from the acidophils, whereas flat, so FSH, LH, ACTH and TSH, which are acting by increasing CAMP, are all coming from basophils. So obviously CRH stimulates ACTH, GnRH stimulates LH and FSH, TRH stimulates TSH, GHRH stimulates GH, whereas very important is dopamine inhibits prolactin. So this is the only negative regulator from the hypothalamus via the stalk. So dopamine inhibits prolactin. This is the first takeaway from this. Others are pretty self-explanatory. Very important, what prolactin does to GnRH. So you can see how prolactin actually inhibits GnRH. So this is going to help you understand the symptoms of hyperprolactinemia. Anytime, let's say you have a prolactinoma, secreting a lot of prolactin, GnRH is going to go down, and that is why you're going to have low FSH and LH, and that is why person will come to you with infertility and amenorrhea, as well as hot flushes can be given or low bone density can be given. So basically the estrogen and progesterone are on a low because FSH, LH is low. So hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism results from hyperprolactinemia. I hope that helps you understand this symptom presentation. Apart from that, another tangent that you can see here is that TRH here is coming and activating prolactin. So TRH increases prolactin. So that also tells me one thing, that in patients who have hypothyroidism, all right, let's say they have thyroiditis and they have hypothyroidism, that TRH is going to be high. So because of this also you can have raised prolactin. So this is one cause that you want to rule out in patients who have hyperprolactinemia, all right. So this is one more thing that we can understand. Apart from that, somatostatin inhibits TSH and GH. We know it's GH, but it's TSH as well. All right. So three things I want to highlight as far as prolactin is concerned. One is dopamine inhibits prolactin. So can I say that dopa blockers, D2 blockers are also going to cause hyperprolactinemia? Yes, dushman ka dushman is dost is how we can remember this, okay? Then you want to remember prolactin inhibits GnRH, so it reduces FSH-LH. Hypothyroidism can also increase prolactin. So these three takeaways are from this control of hypothalamus and pituitary. So now with this, let's go to prolactinoma. How do we approach a patient with prolactinoma? So first of all, the symptoms I think are now clear. The patients are going to present with amenorrhea, infertility, galactorrhea because prolactin levels are high, hot flashes and reduced bone density can also be there. So what are the first things before you jump to an MRI pituitary? Because this is what they'll test. Our first instinct would be, let's just do MRI pituitary, pick out this pituitary tumor and we are sorted. But no, first you want to rule out the other mimics of hyperprolactinemia, and this is where you will get questions, okay? So remember that what you want to rule out, first you want to do a TSH because you want to rule out hypothyroidism. I've already told you why. You want to do an RFT because renal failure, if the kidneys can't excrete prolactin, again it's going to be high. You're going to rule out renal failure by doing RFT. You're going to do a UPT, rule out pregnancy, because obviously in pregnancy prolactin is physiologically high. So rule that out first. Rule out drugs such as D2 blockers. So patient could be on antipsychotics like haloperidol, or patient could be on D2 blockers such as antiemetics such as domperidone or metoclopramide. So rule out all of these drugs, okay? Very, very important. Now, as far as the values are concerned, remember any prolactin more than 20 is high. But anytime you get a value of around 200 or more, then you have to straight away suspect that it's most likely because of a prolactinoma. None of these causes can give you values as high as 200, alright? So these are two numbers, 20 and 200, that you want to remember. So we've ruled all of these out. What do you do next? So the investigation of choice for a prolactinoma is a MRI pituitary. You do the MRI pituitary, you can either find a microadenoma or a macroadenoma. How to distinguish is to find a microadenoma or a macroadenoma. The distinguishing factor is the size. More than 10 mm is macro, less than 10 mm is a microadenoma. Alright, so here remember, if the patient is asymptomatic, you need not treat the patient. Treatment is not needed. But if the patient is symptomatic, you will first rely on medical management. The drug of choice is gonna be cabergoline. So cabergoline is dopa agonist, isn't it? It's a dopa agonist, and we know dopamine inhibits prolactin. So this is how it will work. Whereas what you want to remember, bromocriptine, again a dopa agonist, can be used as the drug of choice in pregnancy. So this is the drug of choice in pregnancy. Alright, so cabergoline and bromocriptine are your first line drugs if it's a very large adenoma with mass effect. So if it's a macroadenoma with mass effect, you're having bitemporal hemianopia or mass effect, then you want to undergo surgery, which is going to be transnasal transsphenoidal pituitary resection. Okay, so this is about the entire approach to prolactinoma. Now we go on to one case scenario which you frequently get. So they will give you this history postpartum, and I know that when you hear postpartum, you are going to mark this. So remember, when you have postpartum fatigue, most importantly, patient cannot lactate, there is amenorrhea, tired female with hypoglycemia, constipation and postural hypotension. So basically what I have listed out for you is a hypopituitarism, pan-hypopituitarism. None of the hormones from the pituitary are working. We have no GnRH, so there is amenorrhea. There is no prolactin, so there is failure to lactate. There is no ACTH, so there is hypoglycemia. There is fatigue. There is no TSH, so there is constipation. Again, ACTH, no cortisol, so there is postural hypotension. So this is hypopituitarism for you. Following a postpartum state, they can give you history of postpartum hemorrhage. I am talking about Sheehan. Yes, I'm sure you all guessed it. This is Sheehan's syndrome. What happens here? Because of the postpartum hemorrhage, you are having pituitary ischemic necrosis. All right, and because of that, when you do an MRI, what you're gonna see is that there is just fluid which is present. There is no pituitary. You just see CSF. There is the stalk which is there. So this is what we call as the empty sella appearance. Very important that this is empty sella, which you will find in Sheehan's. Okay, so understand this scenario and the radiological appearance. Now we go on to acromegaly. So first of all, when would you have a clinical suspicion of acromegaly? So acromegaly is increased growth hormone after skeletal maturity. All right, so what you're going to have is increased soft tissue proliferation throughout the body. They can show you these set of 3 x-rays as well. So what you see in the phalanges is this overgrowth of the tuft of phalanges. It looks like a spade. So this is known as a spade phalanx. What you're gonna see in the X-ray of the foot is this increased heel pad thickness. This is so specific that you won't hear this phrase anywhere else in the body, all right? So this is when they give you increased heel pad thickness, you know they're talking about acromegaly. In the skull, you're going to have overgrowth of the bones and the sinuses. So you'll have prognathism, which can result. you will have increased size of the paranasal sinuses, you can have sella which increases because there is a sellar adenoma. So all of these changes, which are nothing but proliferation of soft tissue and bone in the body, is going to result in acromegaly. So I have a suspicion now. The first test, this is what they'll ask you, what is the initial investigation of choice? Your answer is going to be IGF-1. IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, is your initial investigation of choice. If this comes out to be raised, you go for confirmatory test. Very, very important throughout endocrine. Remember, initial confirmatory are always going to be biochemical tests. It's never radiological. Radiological is only going to be for localization. All right, remember this. You will never answer MRI or any radiology for any confirmation. It's only for localization. And me being a radiologist, it hurts me a lot to say this, but this is how it is. Okay, so initial is IGF-1, whereas confirmatory is oral glucose suppression test. The concept is, normal person, if you give glucose, body will be like, I don't want any more growth hormone. All right, so growth hormone will be suppressed. Growth hormone, remember, is opposite. It plays on the opposite team of insulin. So insulin is on one side and everybody else in the world is teaming up against him. So we have glucagon, we have growth hormone, we have cortisol. Everybody is on the opposite side of insulin who are trying to increase the glucose. So when I give glucose, GH is like, okay, somebody else is also on my team, I need not work. So when I give a glucose load in normal people, there will be GH suppression. So you can see how if I give a 75 gram oral glucose test, just like we do for diabetes or for GDM, it will suppress the GH to less than 1 microgram in normal. If that does not happen, if that is not suppressed, means some GH is coming from somewhere, from a tumor, yeah. So then I go for localization. Now you see radiology coming in. So for localization, I go for MRI of the brain. If I find a pituitary lesion, I am sorted. It is basically pituitary adenoma, which is the cause. If I find that the pituitary is normal, then I need to rule out ectopic GH secreting tumors, which could be carcinoid tumors in the lung or elsewhere. All right. So for this, we can do a DOTA-NOC PET. Just remember this from endocrine. DOTA-NOC PET helps you identify neuroendocrine tumors such as carcinoid, such as pheochromocytoma. Okay, so this is sorted. Now let's go to the management. Now I have found a pituitary mass. Okay, so here I can either do medical management or surgical management, just like prolactinoma. If there is mass effect, we are sorted, we have to go for surgery. Yeah, same surgery, transnasal, transphenoidal pituitary resection. But otherwise, we want to start the patient on medical management. So here, once I find a pituitary lesion, remember the management first line is going to be surgery. As long as the pituitary lesion is resectable, we go for surgery. But if it is an unresectable mass, then we have other options such as radiotherapy. We can give octreotide to the patient, or we can give a specific GH antagonist. And what is that drug? That could be a pharma question. That is pegvisomant. All right. So somant. So this is pegvisomant, which is an antagonist of GH. And remember, so visual side effects are so cute that they will give you the answer in the name itself, like pegvisomant, like vigabatrin, you know. So here also in pegvisomant also you have visual field defects, which could be a side effect. All right. So this is about approach to acromegaly. Next, we go to posterior pituitary. This is one area which I have seen students struggle a lot. Okay, so we are going to compile everything here itself in one table. So two aspects. So we are going to be talking here about ADH predominantly. What ADH does is it acts on the V2 receptor on the kidney, and what it does is it increases aquaporin 2 channels, which increase water reabsorption. So as the name says, it is anti-diuretic. It is saving water for the body. So when I have SIADH because of certain causes, when I have increased ADH, does it make sense? Too much water is reabsorbed. So what happens to urine osmolarity? It is gonna increase. Okay, fair enough. Once you've gotten this down, everything else is very easy. So the trick is urine and plasma osmolarity are going to go in opposite directions anytime we are talking about any ADH problem. So whenever I'm talking about diabetes insipidus or SIADH, they are going to go in opposite direction. So once I've figured that urine osmolarity is going to be high, plasma osmolarity is going to be low. We know that when plasma osmolarity is low, serum sodium is also going to be low, because sodium is what determines the plasma osmolarity the most, alright? So that goes in the same direction. And one secret is what I'm going to tell you here is that ADH and uric acid levels are inversely proportional. This is very, very important. So SIADH, ADH is high. So what happens to uric acid? It's going to be low. Just remember this. It doesn't really help you in SIADH, but I'll tell you where this will be really useful. Okay. So in SIADH, what is happening is hyponatremia. Now, one very important thing that you want to remember here is that it is euvolemic hyponatremia. What is the meaning of this euvolemic hyponatremia is that when there is so much water reabsorption which is happening, the body just can't keep taking this volume expansion. It releases an agent which is ANP. Atrial natriuretic peptide responds to the expansion in the right atrium and it releases ANP, which is a natriuretic compound, and it makes the body lose a lot of water. So because of this, because of the urine getting lost because of ANP, we will not have any edema. So this is known as the escape because of ANP, and that is why it is euvolemic. You will not have any edema. Alright, so this is about euvolemic hyponatremia. If you don't understand any of it, you just remember this phrase that in SIADH there is euvolemic hyponatremia. Again, just like everywhere, what we are going to do to confirm SIADH is give more water. Body already has a lot of water, give more water. Despite that, if ADH remains high, means there is something wrong. So that is how we are going to prove it. Water loading test, ADH remains high, it is SIADH. Certain causes of SIADH, this has been asked a lot about the drugs, alright. So what are the drugs which cause SIADH? So chlorpropamide, did we study this today itself? We did. Oxcarbamazepine. This is a repeat INICET question that oxcarbamazepine has more SIADH as compared to carbamazepine. Both do. Ox has more. Vincristine, SSRI and cyclophosphamide. So this list you definitely want to remember. Apart from that, any pulmonary pathology, there's a very long table in Robbins here which you have. I've just taken the most important ones. So small cell CA, pneumonia and encephalitis are also other causes here. Okay. So now how do you manage SIADH? So remember, initially you just want to do a fluid restriction. In case it does not respond, you want to go to Vaptans. Vaptans are your V2 blockers which are going to block the action of the ADH. Alright, so this is about SIADH which we've taken care of once and for all. Now let's go to diabetes insipidus. Exact opposite is happening. Diabetes insipidus means you don't have ADH. Before I go there, remember now we are doing a approach method wherein I'm teaching you 4 diseases which are going to present with polydipsia, polyuria. So this one more topic I've just compiled here itself. So 4 DDs of polydipsia, polyuria are going to be DI, which is central or nephrogenic. Primary polydipsia, which is a psychiatric disorder wherein patient is drinking a lot of water, or diabetes mellitus. Alright, so we are doing this approach right here. So now in central diabetes insipidus or nephrogenic DI, because ADH is not there, water absorption will reduce, so the urine osmolarity is going to be very low. Isn't it? Too much water getting lost in urine, urine osmolarity goes down. And I know without a thought that because this is ADH related, this is going to be high. Because plasma is high, serum sodium becomes high. What about uric acid? Now this is where the magic comes in. So in central DI, technically the pituitary is not producing ADH, so ADH values are low. So uric acid is going to be high. But in nephrogenic DI, what is going to happen? You have resistance of the V2 receptor. So ADH values are going to be technically high. They're just not acting. So ADH is high, so uric acid is going to be low. So this is how, without giving any sort of information, the examiner can also ask you, and you can distinguish whether it is central DI or nephrogenic DI. Okay. Now, if this is not given, the proper conventional way is water deprivation test, which I will teach you. Before that, let's talk about primary polydipsia. Primary polydipsia, patient is just drinking a lot of water, so urine osmolarity is low, plasma osmolarity is low. They don't go together because it's not an ADH problem. Yeah, you see that? Serum sodium here is gonna be normal because the body regulates the sodium. It does not let it fall just because of too much water intake. Uric acid here is not important, it remains normal. Okay. Coming to diabetes mellitus, the most important thing is going to be urine osmolarity is high because the polyuria here is happening because of osmotic diuresis, glycosuria resulting in osmotic diuresis. So this is where you can straight away distinguish it. This is the only one out of the polyuria polydipsia where urine osmolarity is high. So the ball stops here. You can diagnose this straight away. Rest of the things don't really matter here. Okay, so this is diabetes. You do glycemic control, you treat diabetes per se. Whereas for the others, how do you diagnose? So for this, we have the water deprivation test. So very simple, as the name says, you don't give water. So no water for 2 to 3 hours, and then you measure the osmolarity. If urine osmolarity increases to more than 600, it means what? That you were drinking too much water. I solved that problem and everything is sorted. So the diagnosis is made. If that is not the case, means it is diabetes insipidus. So then what I do is I administer desmopressin. After desmopressin, if it improves, it is central DI. If it doesn't improve, it is nephrogenic. As simple as that. Looking at this flowchart, it might seem scary, but it's nothing. You stop the fluid, osmolarity increases, it's primary polydipsia. Management obviously is fluid restriction. If the water deprivation test osmolarity remains low, it improves after ADH. The treatment also is the same. We give nasal ADH, which is desmopressin. Alright. Remember, nasal desmopressin is also the drug of choice for nocturnal enuresis. Okay. Apart from that, we can also use desmopressin in hemophilia. Okay, hemophilia and von Willebrand disease, because it increases the secretion of von Willebrand factor from the endothelial cells. So that's also an integration for you here. Nephrogenic DI, the drug of choice is thiazide because it promotes natriuresis. Okay, so thiazide is the drug of choice here. So this in a nutshell is all of the difficult topic in my opinion of polyuria, polydipsia, ADH control and everything. I hope it is better now. Okay. Now going on to Cushing syndrome. So Cushing syndrome is anytime cortisol is high. Simply put, Cushing syndrome means cortisol levels is high. Cushing's disease, on the other hand, means cortisol being high because of an ACTH secreting pituitary adenoma. Alright, so that's the difference. How the patient presents, I know you know it from like the first year itself. You're going to have this fat patient with buffalo hump. You're going to have these abdominal stria. You'll have thin arms and legs. You can have myopathy. I've taught you this in rheumat as well, that there's myopathy which is associated. And what is very important is what it does to the different inflammatory cells. Alright, you know that cortisol leads to a secondary immunosuppression, right? There is higher risk of infection. How that does is overall in the blood, if you measure neutrophil, the blood count increases. There is neutrophilia, but that is because there is reduced chemotaxis. It's not really going where it needs to, it just remains in the blood. So effectively there is immunosuppression which results, whereas eosinophil and lymphocytes undergo reduction. This is very important, okay, which I feel can be tested. Apart from that, bones are also very weak. So there is osteopenia which can result. There is myopathy which can result. There is hypertension which can result. In fact, impaired glucose tolerance, I told you it plays on the opposite team. So there can be diabetes mellitus. So all of these are effects of Cushing's syndrome. So now overall, when I have Cushing syndrome, the most common cause is chronic exogenous steroid intake. As simple as it gets, you are taking that extra cortisol, alright. So that is the most common cause. That can be ruled out just by history. But if that is not the cause, you want to rule out whether it's a pituitary adenoma or not. So to confirm whether it is Cushing syndrome, you have to do a low dose DMS. Alright, so low dose dexamethasone is the test that you do the first to confirm if it is Cushing syndrome or not, wherein you give 1 mg of dexamethasone, and then so what you're going to do is you're going to give 1 mg of dexamethasone and you're going to see if it got suppressed or not. In normal patient, if dexamethasone I give, what's going to happen to cortisol? It's going to go down. But if cortisol remains high, it means that there is something which is producing cortisol, right? So that is how we confirm Cushing syndrome. I hope that concept is driven home, that you just do what will suppress that tumor, that is known as the suppression test, and if it still remains high, means something is wrong. Okay, that's the common principle. So we do a low dose DMS, the cortisol remains high. What you go for next is the ACTH. If ACTH is low, means it's not the pituitary which is producing the ACTH, it is the adrenal. So this is adrenal adenoma, and that is why pituitary is suppressed, ACTH is low. So this is the adrenal cause. If ACTH is high, means it's either pituitary or it's an ectopic ACTH producing tumor. So what I do to confirm that is a high dose dexamethasone suppression. Very important, this is where high dose DMS comes in. In high dose DMS, what we do is we give 2 mg dexamethasone 6 hourly for 48 hours. Okay. If it is suppressed at such high doses, even pituitary is like, fine, I'm gonna go down. Alright, so this is where pituitary adenoma would be diagnosed. Alright, so this is how we diagnose that it's a Cushing's disease. It is a pituitary tumor producing ACTH, whereas if it is not suppressed, it is likely an ectopic ACTH producing carcinoid that you have to rule out with a Dotanoc. Okay, I hope this is clear. Confirmation of Cushing syndrome is by low dose DMS. High dose is to distinguish pituitary versus ectopic. So this is about Cushing syndrome. With this, we've finished pituitary, which I believe is one of the most difficult systems. Now we go on to calcium and parathyroid metabolism, which is also very scary when you look at this slide. Alright, when you look at all of these values together, it seems a bit overwhelming, but never ever memorize this. I know you are looking at a Buri Tarah Rato course, but if you try and memorize this, agar isko rata, you will never remember. Alright, so you have to understand the concepts here. So let's understand how calcium homeostasis is maintained in the body. So there are mainly 3 players which are regulating it. Okay, what are most important to us are 2. So first is parathyroid, second is vitamin D, and third is going to be calcitonin, which we are not really concerned with as far as the homeostasis is concerned in all of these disorders, but I'll still tell you what each of these does to calcium and phosphate. That is what you have to first understand. If you understand the concept, everything is going to be very easy. So remember, what PTH does is it causes bony resorption. Alright, and apart from that, it will increase the excretion of phosphate from the kidneys. So overall, what it does to calcium and phosphate is opposite. Just like we saw with osmolarity of urine and plasma with ADH, same thing happens here, that the calcium increases and phosphate reduces. Got it? On the other hand, what vitamin D does is it increases calcium and phosphate, both of them from the intestine. It increases the absorption of both of them, and that is why both the values are increased. So what you want to understand is in PTH disorders, these go opposite. In vitamin D disorders, they go together. Alright, whereas calcitonin, anytime calcium is increased, it will reduce it. That's the main function. Phosphate also reduces to a certain extent, but the most important is calcium going down. Okay, so this is about these 2. Now, how does ALP relate to parathyroid? So whenever parathyroid is causing bony resorption, the bone is not gonna just take it sitting down that, alright, come and destroy me. It's gonna repair itself also. So how that does is by ALP. So ALP is the marker of bone formation. So can I say anytime PTH is high, ALP is gonna be high? Yeah, anytime bone is resorbed, bone is also gonna be formed. So both of these go together. But is that true for PTH being low? ALP will be low? No. Anytime PTH is low means bone is not getting destroyed. isn't it? So that does not mean bone formation will go down. ALP stays normal then. Okay, so this is what you have to understand. If you remember these thumb rules, filling this table on your own is going to be very easy. Never ever memorize this table or look at annotated PDF also. Fill it on your own. Okay, so in rickets and osteomalacia, what is the problem is vitamin D levels are low. Okay, so because of vitamin D levels being low, calcium and phosphate are gonna be low. So calcium goes down, phosphate goes down because reabsorption is low. Because calcium is low, what will PTH do? PTH will have to become high. So PTH is the main responder of hypocalcemia, is how you want to look at it. So whenever PTH increases, what happens to ALP? ALP increases. So this is how we go about each and every column here. In primary hyperparathyroidism, the problem here is that there is a parathyroid adenoma which is producing a lot of parathormone. All right, so this is going to result in a lot of parathormone. So you want to remember that main problem is PTH is very high. PTH is very high, so calcium is high and phosphate is low, and anytime PTH is high, obviously ALP is going to be high. Is this clear? Also remember one more thing, investigation of choice for a parathyroid adenoma is a SESTA-MIBI scan. Multiple times asked repeat question. Okay, remember this. Going to secondary hyper-PTH. Things slightly get tricky here. What happens in secondary hyper-PTH is there is chronic kidney disease. So because of that, the final step of vitamin D activation, that is the 1-alpha hydroxylase step, is not happening. So you have a relative functional vitamin D deficiency. So can I say calcium is low? And what about phosphate? Because the kidney is not able to excrete the phosphate out, phosphate is high. This is the hallmark, that phosphate is going to be high because kidneys are not able to excrete the phosphate. Because calcium is low, how will PTH be? It will raise and it will try and normalize the calcium, and in the process ALP also increases. So the hallmark between primary and secondary is the fact that phosphate is going to be high in secondary HPT. Talking about hypercalcemia of malignancy, such as squamous cell, right? So squamous cell CA produces this. What it does is it produces this compound known as PTH related peptide. It does the same job as PTH, so it increases calcium, it decreases phosphate. But then what will happen to PTH? Does PTH have to work? PTH is like, no, I can just chill because there is somebody who's doing my job. So PTH goes down, and that is why ALP remains normal. Okay, so this is where functionally it is like hyperparathyroidism, but PTH levels are gonna be opposite. Okay, in sarcoidosis, what happens? We've already talked about this in rheumat. If you've seen that, you have non-caseating granulomas which produce 1-alpha hydroxylase. So 1-alpha hydroxylase activates vitamin D. So there is more vitamin D. So calcium and phosphate increase. And because of this, the PTH levels go down and you have ALP, which is normal. Okay. Hypo-PTH, exact opposite. PTH is low. This could be because of autoimmunity being the most common cause, or there could be granulomatous destruction of the parathyroid, or it could be iatrogenic because of surgical removal of the glands, or basically vascular supply. This we have learned in thyroid surgery, isn't it? So this is about the causes of hypo-PTH. So because PTH is low, calcium is going to be low, whereas phosphate is going to be high, and ALP remains normal. Okay, so this is how it is exact opposite of how hyper-PTH functions. Now, slightly complicating it. So this is again more important for INICT. FMG students can just ignore this. So pseudo hypo-PTH is when you have end organ resistance. So I have parathyroid which is coming from the gland, but it's not able to act. So functionally it is a state of hypo-PTH. So same as hypo-PTH, except for the fact that the values are going to be high because there is end organ resistance. Okay, and ALP, now this is also tricky because PTH is high, but is it functioning? It's not functioning. So here they don't go together, right? Here they don't go together because ALP is normal. All right, so one more thing you want to remember in pseudo hypo-PTH is the fact that you have something known as Albright hereditary osteodystrophy here. So you are gonna have short knuckles. That is what is known as Albright's hereditary osteodystrophy. So the third and fourth knuckles are gonna be smaller. So in these children, if I want to play this game called knuckle, 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 I can't do that because I'll see two knuckles and then there'll be dimples because their metacarpals are shortened, alright? So that is known as knuckle, knuckle, dimple, dimple sign. Basically, their third and fourth metacarpals are gonna be shortened, alright? Now, the same manifestation happens in pseudo hypo-PTH, but the beauty is that all of the hormones are going to remain normal. Biochemically, this is all normal because there's problem with downstream regulations at the level of CAMP. Okay. So this is the best. I'm sure you love this so far because everything remains normal except for the phenotype manifestation where you do have Albright hereditary osteodystrophy. Paget's is also very easy here. So in Paget's, you have isolated ALP which is raised and everything else is normal. So anytime you have isolated ALP rise, consider Paget's, and osteoporosis is the best of them all because there is just bone mineral density reduction. Everything else remains normal. Okay. So I hope you understood this. So at the end of this, you either come out very happy because you've understood the concept and you will never have to look at it again, or you are really confused and you are probably going to stop this video at this point and take a break, and I would highly recommend doing that. But just don't abandon me or abandon endocrine system. Just come back at it with a fresh perspective sometime later on and then just continue with the next slide. Okay, so now we are starting off with the treatment of osteoporosis. So here again, very important pharma chapter here that you need to understand the mechanisms. So the drugs here can either inhibit osteoclast, they can stimulate osteoblast, or they could have a dual action. This is the main action wherein they inhibit osteoclast. So the drug of choice for osteoporosis is bisphosphonates, which inhibit osteoclast. There are three main adverse effects that you want to consider. One is esophagitis, and that is why we advise that after eating bisphosphonates, sit for 30 minutes, sit erect for 30 minutes. So that is one, esophagitis. Second is the osteonecrosis of the mandible. All right, so osteonecrosis of the mandible. And the third effect that you want to remember is atypical femur neck fractures. All right, so remember we are giving it for osteoporosis to prevent fracture, and one of its own side effects is atypical femur neck fracture. This has come as a repeat INICT question wherein they said that patient is on long-term bisphosphonate treatment and now complains of hip pain. What will you do next? So we want to do an X-ray in order to rule out a hip or a femur fracture. All right, so this has been tested previously, and that is why bisphosphonates we'll give for a few years, then we give few years of drug holiday, and then we resume. All right, so that's the reason behind it. The longest acting bisphosphonate is zolendronate. So you can remember from my name, Z for zolendronate, most effective, longest acting. All right, so that is zolendronate, and because of this we can just give this as an annual injection. All right, so this can be given once in a year. That's how long acting it is. But one side effect is renal failure. It can lead to renal side effects. Okay, so the main drug that we have here is raloxifene, which does not have any side effect of endometrial hyperplasia like tamoxifen, nor does it have breast C as a side effect. The only side effect it has, which is also very serious, one is DVT, and that is why it is not much preferred. We have denosumab, very important for exam point of view, monoclonal antibodies. I will not teach you this again in pharma. Here we have to deal with denosumab. This is a rank ligand inhibitor. So rank ligand inhibitor inhibits the activation of rank, which is situated on the osteoclast. So remember, this is an osteoclast with rank. This denosumab binds to rank ligand on the osteoblast and prevents the activation of osteoclast. All right, so this is denosumab. Calcitonin also can be used here, but this is mainly used for refractory hypercalcemia. And very important, particularly in hyper-PTH, we have cinacalcet, which is a calcium sensitizer receptor agonist. So this is CAS-R agonist, basically the PTH receptors who tells them that the blood calcium is low, you should be secreted. This is the CASR receptors. All right, so basically cinacalcet is going to bind to it, and it's going to tell that parathyroid that we have enough calcium in the body, you can just chill out. So that is how we can use it in hyper PTH. Only one drug which can stimulate osteoblast is a short chain of parathyroid, which is PTH 1 to 34 amino acid, coming as teri or abaloparatide. That's all you want to remember. Whereas dual action, remember, is by romosozumab. Again, a new monoclonal antibody that you want to remember, which inhibits sclerostin. Sclerostin has a dual action of activating osteoclast and inhibiting blast. We inhibit sclerostin only. So that is romosozumab. So remember, in its name, you have OS. I will teach you this in pharma when I teach you the tricks of monoclonal antibody. From OS, you can know that this is osteo, and that is how once you land up at the category of drugs, half of your options are eliminated, and you can solve an MCQ. Whereas strontium also, remember, has a dual action. So this is S and R. SR have dual action. Yeah, senior residents have dual action. They have to teach also, they have to work also. So that's how you can remember. Okay, so this is about treatment of osteoporosis. With this, we go on to the next gland, which is thyroid. In thyroid, we don't have to do much because we've already covered this in surgery. Only thing I want to focus on is Graves' disease. And before that, just this one important table about what happens during pregnancy. So in pregnancy, remember, the main thing is thyroid binding globulin increase, as I've already told you this in OBG as well. So what happens is there's a lot of bound hormone which increase, and that is why overall the total T4 increases. Apart from that, beta HCG levels are high, and you know that because of this molecular mimicry, this beta HCG can also mimic the action of TSH and produce a lot of thyroid hormone, and that is why you have thyroid hormone production which increases. So overall, everything increases. Total increases by almost 1.5x, whereas free also increases. Okay, so this is what you want to remember. An increased TBG results in more total than free. And TSH reduces because, as I said, beta HCG is doing its job. So TSH is just chilling out, that somebody is activating the thyroid for me. I can just sleep. So TSH reduces. So the question here could be that if there is a female who has hypothyroidism and now becomes pregnant, what should be the dose? So obviously, because thyroid binding globulin is increasing, we are going to have to increase her dose by almost around 50%. All right. So her dose has to be increased for thyroxine, the levothyroxine that she's taking, that needs to be increased. So that's the applied question out of this. Now going on to the main thing, which is Graves' disease. So this I've already told you in surgery as well. You are going to see this very beefy looking gland pathology wise, and you have this scalloping of the colloid that we are going to be seeing when we look at the pathology. What happens in Graves' disease is you have long-acting thyroid stimulators, or you have TSH receptor antibodies basically, which are auto-activating the thyroid. Somebody is binding to that and auto-activating the thyroid to produce a lot of hormones. So as a result of this, what all can happen? What happens to bone? This is thyroid bone disease. So remember, thyroid hormone activates the osteoclast. You have high resorption, and that is why you're going to have osteopenia. One independent question. What happens to the limbs is you are going to see this thyroid acropachy, which is this periostitis. Can you see this feather-like periostitis here? So that is what is going to result from thyroid hormone. You have a lot of glycosaminoglycans which get deposited. This is an image-based question, very important, which is resulting in pretibial myxedema. Even though the name is myxedema, which indicates that this would be seen in hypothyroid, remember, this is a misnomer. This is seen in Graves as well. All right, so this is GAG getting increased, and again, because the soft tissue and GAGs are proliferating, you will have orbital expansion. You can have bilateral proptosis. This is known as TED, which is thyroid eye disease. So you're going to have the retroorbital fat also increasing, and you're going to have the muscles also increasing in size. And how the muscles expand is very typical. You can see how just the muscle belly increases, whereas the tendinous insertions remains normal, and this is what is known as a Coca-Cola bottle sign. The order in which the muscles are involved, you can remember I am slow. So it is going to be inferior rectus first, followed by medial rectus, superior rectus, lateral rectus, and then the oblique. So this is the order in which the muscles are involved. So this is thyroid eye disease. There's also a staging for thyroid eye disease, which you can remember as no specs. So class 0 is the least thing, which is no signs or symptoms. So this is Zabardasti for the mnemonic. O is only signs such as lid retraction, stare, which I'm going to teach you. S is soft tissue involvement, so expansion is starting. Third is proptosis. So this is where proptosis comes in. Remember, it's going to be an axial proptosis for thyroid, which is frequently bilateral. Then the muscles, then the cornea, and then you can have optic nerve getting compressed actually by so much muscle expansion. Okay. So this is your grading for thyroid eye disease. No need to memorize it, but just go through it one more time. Now talking about the things that you really have to memorize, which are the names of the signs. So here when you have a staring look like this very angry looking female, you want to remember stell, wag, sign. All right, so you want to remember that there is a dog who is very angry, staring at you and wagging its tail, stell, wag sign. Then when you have absent creases on the forehead, so we get creases on our forehead when you're very stressed. Like I'm very stressed, I have to complete all of the recordings in a very short amount of time, so I have a lot of creases. But somebody who is like Joffrey, do you know Joffrey from Game of Thrones? One more reference in the same video. He does not have any tension in life because he is the king. Yeah, so you remember Joffroy's. So Joffroy sign is absent creases on the forehead because Joffrey has no stress. Hyperpigmentation on the superior eye fold, like you can see in this lady here, is because of burns. You can remember burning leads to hyperpigmentation. Just go with it. In Hindi, burning means to jalna, right? So that is jalna. So you can remember this is the Jelnik sign. All right. So Jelnik sign is hyperpigmentation. Loss of lateral third of the eyebrows. So this is something that I want to correlate here with a toxicity. Which toxicity did we learn that the specific sign was madarosis, loss of lateral third of eyebrow? That was thallium, isn't it? So what you want to remember is that if somebody will hurt you, you would want to kill them with thallium because thallium is the most ideal homicidal agent. Yeah. So if somebody will hurt you, so from this you want to remember Hertoghe sign. Hertoghe sign, thallium, loss of lateral eyebrows. All right, so this is how we have interlinked a lot of things and remember this mnemonic. Then you have retraction of upper eyelid. Here I don't really have a mnemonic. You can message me one if you find it. That is Dalrymple sign, where there is just retraction. Lid lag of the upper eyelid on downward gaze, very important for the exam, is Von Graffe sign. And lastly, inability to converge the eye is Mobius sign. All right, so Mobius syndrome also I've taught you as a teratogenic effect for 6th and 7th cranial nerve palsy. Which drug? Misoprostol, right? So you want to remember misoprostol was Mobius syndrome. This is Mobius sign. Fine. So these are all of the named signs which could be asked to you. How do you manage Graves' disease? So remember, we can do a radioiodine ablation. This is the mainstay of the treatment. So we can give iodine 131 to ablate the gland. All right. So that is radioiodine ablation. But this is contraindicated in pregnancy. Obviously, we can't give radioiodine. And when you have very severe thyroid eye disease, the radioiodine can actually aggravate the symptoms. So you don't want to give there. So in pregnancy, the mainstay is going to be pharmacotherapy or drugs. As far as the drugs are concerned, two main drugs that you want to remember is PTU, propthiouracil, and we have methimazole or carbimazole. All right, so these are the two main drugs that you want to remember. Remember that in pregnancy, in the first trimester, PTU is what is preferred. So P for pregnancy, P for PTU, because this is safe, whereas methimazole, carbimazole are gonna have teratogenic effects in the form of cutis aplasia and choanal atresia. So you want to remember all C's together: carbimazole, cutis, and guanil. All right, so first trimester PTU, after that you can switch the patients to methimazole and carbimazole because PTU has agranulocytosis, and both of these drugs in fact are hepatotoxic, PTU more than the others. Okay, so this is about their side effects. Surgery is mainly relied upon when you have severe thyroid eye disease. You would want to do orbital decompression and also surgical removal of thyroid. Okay, so this is about the management of Graves' disease per se. Last thing we want to do is adrenal. So first we want to talk about adrenal insufficiency here in one slide. Very, very important. So before I go to adrenal insufficiency, you got to know what adrenal does in order to know what will happen when it doesn't function. So remember GFR, glomerulosa, fasciculata and reticulata. These are the three layers of the adrenal cortex which will not work in adrenal insufficiency. So remember that glomerulosa is going to produce the mineralocorticoids, the fasciculata is going to produce the glucocorticoids, whereas reticulata produces the sex steroids or the androgens. All right, so how to remember this is a first aid mnemonic. The deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. All right, so that's how you can remember that mineralocorticoid. Then you have sugar cortisol, which is glucocorticoids, and then you have the androgens. Okay, so this is about the layers. So now primary adrenal insufficiency means that the adrenal is not working. So each of these are not going to be formed, and most common cause is autoimmune. In our country, one more cause is tuberculosis. Very, very important. All right, so the adrenal is gone. So now what is going to happen? Cortisol is going to be low and ACTH will rise in response. And what about aldosterone? Aldosterone is also going to be low. So there are going to be severe symptoms, and hyperpigmentation is the hallmark because ACTH is high. So because the entire POMC chain produces ACTH, MSH also increases, and this is the hallmark that you focus on, that in primary, P for primary, P for pigmentation. This is your buzzword in the question. And you'll also have hyperkalemia because mineralocorticoid is not functioning. So you have low BP, you have low sodium, and you have high potassium. Potassium and H plus go together, so you also have acidosis here. Okay, on the other hand, in secondary, what is happening is from the pituitary, ACTH is not coming. So ACTH is low, and that is why cortisol is low and aldosterone remains normal. Because what is the regulator of mineralocorticoids? It is renin-angiotensin system, whereas for glucocorticoids it is ACTH. So here mainly it is going to be cortisol which is low and aldosterone which is normal, and you have no hyperpigmentation and no hyperkalemia because mineralocorticoids are fine. And the most common cause is chronic steroid treatment, again causing the suppression of the hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, so this is about insufficiency. So you will recognize it. Now how do we approach? So to confirm, this is very, very important, co-syntropin test. It is nothing but ACTH. You give ACTH and you see, is it responding? So when I give ACTH stimulation, this is nothing but ACTH stimulation test. If I stimulate and it increases, means it is normal. You can rule out adrenal insufficiency here. But if it is low despite stimulation, are you guys understanding this? Whenever a hormone is high, you do a suppression test. Whenever a hormone is low or there is insufficiency, you stimulate it. So ACTH stimulation still low means you have confirmed that there is adrenal insufficiency, there is AI. Now you want to see whether it's primary or secondary, you do the ACTH values. Very simple. If ACTH is low, it means that it is secondary adrenal insufficiency. If ACTH is high, it means it is primary adrenal insufficiency. ACTH is high, it means it is primary adrenal insufficiency. So this is about insufficiency. Now hyperaldosteronism. So the most common cause of more mineralocorticoids is bilateral hyperplasia, or there could be an adrenal adenoma which is hyperfunctioning, which is known as the Conn's syndrome. All right. So pathophysiology here is very important. So what happens when there is high aldosterone? Remember, aldosterone is going to increase the sodium and water reabsorption. So there is hypertension, which results increased blood volume, which results, and what happens in turn, you have more potassium and H plus excretion. So you have low potassium H plus reabsorption leading to hypokalemia and metabolic alkalosis. So you want to remember alkalosis. Potassium is low. Anytime you have H plus and potassium, they go in same direction. So in aldosterone pathologies, potassium is low and there is alkalosis, whereas BP increases, sodium increases. All right. So in this process, what happens is you have high blood volume. So again, our ANP comes in. Remember ANP? Just like SIDH. Again, it promotes natriuresis and limits edema, and this is what is known as aldosterone escape. Very important concept, that even though you have high blood volume, there's going to be no edema. So this is known as aldosterone escape, and the reason is ANP. Okay, so this is also the reason for euvolemic hyponatremia in SIDH. It is also the reason for aldosterone escape. Okay, very important concept that I'm about to teach you, very clinical here. Anytime you have any patient with hypertension and hypokalemia, always you have to do this approach of renin aldosterone. This would be frequently given to you in the question as the PRA, plasma renin aldosterone ratio. So when both are high, renin is high, aldosterone is high, it is likely because of something stimulating renin. So this could be malignant hypertension, or it could be a renin producing tumor. Alright, so a renin producing tumor or malignant hypertension leading to high renin, which further leads to high aldosterone. On the other hand, if aldosterone is high and renin is low, meaning there is aldosteronism, hyperaldosteronism, as we saw in the last slide. So this is primary hyperaldosteronism, either because of bilateral adrenal hyperplasia, or it could be an adenoma known as Conn's syndrome. Thirdly, look at this. Overall, both are low, but still the functional effect is like that of hyperaldosteronism. So here you have to consider Liddle syndrome. In Liddle syndrome, what you have is actually pseudo hyperaldosteronism. So what you're having is overall aldosterone is not functioning, but you have activation at the channel level, which is causing the symptoms. So remember Liddle syndrome here. Apart from that, you can also remember CAH or Cushing syndrome, in which you have exogenous hormones or a person taking exogenous mineralocorticoids. Everywhere the aldosterone is chilling in the body because somebody else is producing that hormone, or the channel is auto activated. This is how you approach this clinical scenario of hypertension and hypokalemia. Very, very important. Okay. Finally, talking about pheochromocytoma. So this is again from surgery, medicine, everywhere compiled. All right, so pheochromo, I'm sure you know the typical triad of headache, sweating, palpitation. It's not like they'll give you a question saying a person has headache, palpitation and sweating, what is the likely diagnosis? That'll not come to you anymore. So remember, the most common symptom here is going to be headache, whereas the most common sign is hypertension or a raised BP. The first investigation, very important in all of this, is slightly controversial because different sources will say different things, and it's something wherein even the literature, differs. So you can choose the best answer depending on what you believe in. So initial investigation is urinary catecholamine. So you can do a urinary catecholamine value, or you can do urine VMA values. Confirmatory or the best investigation, remember, never answer MRI. As I've already said, in all of endocrine, radiology will never be the answer to confirm. So best is plasma metanephrines. All right, so this is plasma metanephrines, which is very, very important as the best investigation to confirm that it is pheochromocytoma. Okay, the best to localize indeed is MRI abdomen, not CT but MRI, which is better, because on MRI you see this T2 weighted coronal image, you see this very hyper intense mass in the suprarenal. This is known as the light bulb sign. So hyper intense, we call it light bulb. Also, liver hemangioma can be referred to as a light bulb because it is very hyper intense. And also one more thing, in posterior dislocation of shoulder, if you see the X-ray, it gives you this appearance of light bulb also. Okay, so these are 3 light bulbs for you. Is biopsy in FNAC ever done for FEO? Answer is no. There is so much epinephrine, norepinephrine which is there. In fact, norepinephrine more than epinephrine in FEO. We will never want to put in a needle in it. So it is basically surgery which is the mainstay. Histopath-wise, you will see this appearance known as Zell-Bollen appearance. Just remember the name. Again, controversial, but best for metastasis of a pheochromocytoma. M for metastasis, M for MIBG, whereas for extra-adrenal, I've put in like so much research just to give you these 2 answers that you can actually trust me here. Best for extra-adrenal is either a DOPA PET or a DOTANOC PET, depending on what you have in the options, okay? So DOPA PET or DOTANOC PET, these are specific to neuroendocrine tumors, and that's why they can pick out extra-adrenal FEO the best. And where you have extra-adrenal FEO most commonly is going to be organs of Zucker-Candle. These are in the para-aortic location. All right, if this is the aorta, para-aortic location is where you can have. Apart from that, you can have bladder FEO. In fact, very typical scenario, anytime patient micturates, the patient starts to have hypertension, palpitation. So that's a very typical history there. You can also have it in the mediastinum. Yeah, so these are all paragangliomas, which are extra-adrenal FEO, and nothing else. You also have the carotid body tumor, which is a paraganglioma, isn't it? Treatment wise, remember, we first must give the patient alpha blockers and then give beta blockers and then take up the patient on surgery. All right, so this is very important, and the reason is vasomotor reversal of Dale, which I have explained to you in pharmacology. Okay, there is rule of 10 for pheochromocytoma, wherein 10% pheo are extra-adrenal, 10% do not have hypertension, 10% pheo occur in children, 10% are bilateral. But there is an exception to this rule that 50% bilaterality is there in syndromic pheo. So what all syndromes have pheochromocytoma? Remember, pheo can be seen in NF1, pheo can be seen in MEN2A and MEN2B, it can be seen in von Hippel-Lindau. So all of these are syndromes where pheo is a part. So 50% bilaterality can be seen here. It is malignant in 10%, but again an exception that it will be 40% if it is a familial case of pheochromocytoma. And previously it was thought to be 10% familial. This is changed. It is now 20% familial. All right. And one more thing that you want to remember, paragangliomas as familial is the succinate dehydrogenase mutation, which is familial paraganglioma syndrome. All right. So the last part is a bit extra edge for INI-CT mainly. But in NEET and FMG, you get simple questions on pheo asking you about Zell-Bollen or light bulb, or they'll give you a scenario and ask you the diagnosis. So this takes care of endocrine for us. A slightly difficult system, I would say, conceptually, but if your concepts are good, this is very scoring for the exams. All right. So I hope this helps, and thank you so much.